leadership through the Australian Republican movement as the member for Wentworth and leader of the opposition, and his government contributions as Australia's 29th Prime Minister and other ministerial roles, for consistently promoting debate and advocating beneficial change for the Australian community, including the same-sex marriage plebiscite, the Snowy Hydro 2.0 major renewable energy facility, legislation to counter foreign interference in Australian elections, and convincing Asia-Pacific partners to consider continue the Pacific Trade Group when the US withdrew in 2017, for promoting the importance of liberal democracy here and internationally by continuing to write and speak out candidly about the importance of a rules-based international order for our security and economy, and the comparative strengths of Australia's remarkable democratic way of life based on mutual respect, the rule of law and the fair go, encouraging achievement but lending a hand to those who fall behind. He reminds all Australians to preserve our commitment to our free and democratic way of life by more fully understanding it and working to strengthen it through their individual daily actions. I give you Malcolm Turnbull, our 2025 Eureka Democracy Award.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. Eric, thank you very much. And Mary, thank you again so much for that wonderful speech. You're far too kind. People are saying so many warm, generous things about me at the moment. It must be because I'm no longer in politics. It's very, very touching. There are even some nice young people on the train we got here, weren't there? Yeah. So, and thank you, Ambassador. Your speech was as eloquent as we would expect from an Irish ambassador. It was great. When you talked about the Republican movement, of course, my predecessor as chairman of the Republican movement was a great Irish Australian, Thomas Keneally, and Tom always used to joke that he was the leader of the Fenian wing of the Republican movement. But look, this is such a great cause that we're all here assembled to honour. That of Eureka, the Eureka Stockade, this stand for democracy, for human dignity, and as Mark Twain observed quoted in that excellent video, while it was a battle lost, the battle was lost, but the war that the diggers were fighting for was won because democracy was achieved. And Australia became one of the leaders in democratic parliamentary democracy in the world. We are the first country in the world where women had the right to vote and stand for parliament. New Zealand was the first where they had the right to vote, but here they had the right to vote and stand for parliament. We have compulsory voting. We've had that for over 100 years. None of us, there's no one alive that can take credit for that. We've had preferential voting for over 100 years. We have an independent electoral commission. And all of those things ensure that our democracy is so much more centred. And when I say centred, it brings the political debate and the issues to the centre. It is that the system, the electoral system, works against the polarisation that angry, divisive, cynical people in public life, in politics, in business, in the media particularly, are endeavouring to do, which is to divide people. If you look at the way politics is operating now in the United States, and I'll come to this in a bit more detail in a minute, because that represents a huge threat to us here in Australia. You can see that much of their problems is because of the fact that they have a very different electoral system. They do not believe that people have a natural right to vote. I mean, the voter suppression is part of the political game, trying to, change the laws, make it hard for people to vote. Our system, it's innate in us as Australians. We should be so proud of that. I mean, the idea that you would do anything to prevent somebody voting is complete anathema to us. I mean, we believe that not only that everyone should vote, we fine you if you don't. So, naturally, if you're going to make it compulsory to vote and fine people if they don't vote, you've got to make it easy to vote. You can't, so it is. And, we estimate, the Australian Electoral Commission estimates that about 97.5% of all Australians who are entitled to be on the electoral roll, that is, Australian citizens over the age of 18, are actually on the roll. It's quite hard not to be on the roll. Any young people here, more recent can remember when they were 18, will know you sort of find yourself put on it pretty much automatically. And of course they will, track you down and demand to know why you haven't voted if you don't vote. What that means is that in political debates and political discourse, you do not have to run off to extremes to get the vote out. See, in many countries, people will try to galvanise the electorate by, you running off with divisive issues to, gee people up, make them angry and get them out to vote. Well, everyone's going to vote here, so there's no point doing that. And you'll see, one of the problems, my party, or, I'm still a member of the Liberal Party, I'm waiting to be expelled at any moment. But everyone tells me I should resign. I say, no, they should let them expel me anyway. But you can see the catastrophic state of affairs in the Liberal Party at the moment is because they have been running off to the right. This was always a challenge, but got worse and worse after I was defenestrated. And they're doing that to win the approval of that right-wing media entertainment ecosystem, best represented by Sky News and, some right-wing shock jocks and the Murdoch tabloids and so forth, the Australian, etc. And that's a diminished group of angry people, basically. And the problem with that is that while that might work in the United States because it will, get people off the couch and get them out to vote, people have to vote here. So of course, it's been electorally catastrophic, and that's why Albo's got 94 seats in the House of Representatives. But the other great thing we've got is with preferential voting, means that if a party does move too far one way or another, there is the opportunity for an independent to come through the centre. And so you've seen, the so-called Teals, Monique Ryan here in Victoria and others in New South Wales and Western Australia, who have been able to come through the centre simply because in all of those seats the Liberal Party moved too far to the right. Now, has the Liberal Party learned a lesson from that? Well, not yet. At some point we would think the penny will drop or a new party will emerge or something else will happen. But what it means is that our system, and this is again what we've got to be we've got to be proud of it, but as I said at Parliament on Thursday, we must not take any of this for granted. Our system brings politics to the centre as opposed to polarising it, whereas in the United States, the system is, polarises it. And of course, so you get people at far extremes. So that's something we've got to be very proud of. Really do. We have a much healthier democracy than either in the United States or in the United Kingdom. I won't speak about Irish democracy. I'll leave the ambassador to speak about that, although we were very inspired by Irish democracy in the Republican movement, because one of the big issues, as you recall, was really the issue on which the referendum founded, was how do you choose the president in an Australian republic? And there were really, because nobody wanted to have a president who had executive powers, was head of government as well as head of state, there were really two options. One was to have a president that was elected by the people, popularly elected, which is the system in Ireland, although there's a complicated nomination process, or have it, chosen by Parliament in a bipartisan way, which is actually the way most countries that have a republic, a non-monarch as head of state do. Anyway, as you know, we don't want to go through the painful history of the Republican movement and how the direct electionists blew the show up and failed to recognise that you shouldn't ever let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But we paid a lot of attention to the Irish experience, and it was, who knows, maybe when the issue comes back again, that's the approach that we'll be taking. In fact, I'll just say this because I know, looking around the room, I can see there are plenty of Republicans here. I can see the great applause when the Australian Republican cause is mentioned. In terms of will we ever become a republic, yes, I believe we will be. I am optimistic. Regrettably, my advice on, 99, which is if we say no, we'll end up being no for a long time, has proved right. But I think the way to do it next time is that we need to have at first a preliminary vote, an advisory national vote on the question of how you choose the president. And we should thrash that out, and it's really parliamentary appointment or direct election. And having had that vote, then whatever the decision is, incorporate that into the amendments that become part of the formal constitutional referendum process. And the reason I say that is that in our experience, whenever we had a group of people, whether it was a big deliberative poll, 100 plus people, or a small focus group, and we talked about the mode of election, support for direct election started high and then rapidly fell off a cliff. In fact, Paul Keating, another Australian of Irish heritage, used to say this to me at the time. He said, be very careful about direct election, he said, because once people think about it and realise it doesn't take long to think about it, that will mean that the president that is supposed to be non-political, non-partisan, etc., will be directly elected, and hence, in the Australian cultural context, likely to be a political person, partisan person. They'll won't be as enthusiastic about it. So anyway, I think if we do that, if we take that approach, I'm disappointed that Albanese has taken it off the agenda. He's still obviously a bit shattered by the loss of the voice referendum. But I think when it comes back on the agenda, if we take that approach, I think we will get it done this time, because I think, the people who have different views about the mode of election will cop it sweet once the people have made a decision. It's a little bit like same-sex marriage, that was a hugely divisive, controversial issue at the time, as we all remember. But, when 63% or so of the population had voted yes, the issue was over. I mean, really, if you could say to someone who had really strong views against it, really deep felt views, you just say, look, I understand your views, I respect them, but you lost. It's a numbers game. If there was a vote and you lost, you just got to respect that. So I think that's where we head for the Republic. Now, let me talk about democracy, generally, and the threats to it. I don't want to be downbeat about it. I mean, I think democracy is even more, Australian democracy is even more resilient than the most athletic potteroo you could ever find. So I think our democracy will survive, Mary, in leaps and bounds that a potteroo could only dream of. We face a real challenge in the world today of rising authoritarianism. It's called populist authoritarianism. The biggest and most troubling example is in the United States. We have to be very clear-eyed about this. The United States no longer share values, democratic values with the United States, or at least with the United States government, with the Trump administration. All of the international institutions that were set up after the Second World War, the United Nations, pretty much all of them, were based upon the proposition that might was not right. I mean, that's the UN Charter talks about respecting the sovereignty of all nations. That was what it was all about. And, the United States used to preach the same doctrine. I mean, it essentially was the leading founder of all of those institutions. And you could say, well, yes, they used to talk about, respecting other countries' sovereignties and respecting democracy, but, they'd snuggle up to tyrants in South America and overthrow governments when they didn't suit them. And yes, you can say that they were inconsistent in their application of those standards, but at least they said that those were their values. Donald Trump does not even pretend he has those values. I mean, Trump makes it very clear that he believes might is right. He says so. He believes his agenda, America First, is designed to ensure, and he says it, that he will use America's economic power and military power to get the best deal for the United States at the expense of other countries, whether they are friend or foe. And of course, the Europeans have seen this, with the huge tariffs that have been imposed on them, and we've had tariffs imposed on us. They're all in breach of the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. Trump doesn't care about that. You've seen the ambassador has just been in Brazil, where you've seen huge swinging tariffs imposed on Brazil. Why? Because Donald Trump objects to the fact that his friend Jair Bolsonaro has been, accused and convicted of, a conspiracy to overthrow the government, which of course are similar charges to which Trump was charged with in the United States. But so essentially, and has imposed sanctions on the Brazilian judge, the leading Brazilian judge involved. This is utterly at odds with the values the United States used to preach. So you can say honestly, and I'm not saying this in a rhetorical or rowdy way. You can say honestly and factually that Trump's values are closer to those of Vladimir Putin than they are to any of his predecessors as president in modern times. I mean, look at the way he talks about Canada. He says Canada shouldn't exist as an independent country. It should become the 51st state. And he's imposed very, very harsh economic coercion on Canada, tariffs, which has hurt Canada enormously because so much, because you can imagine, most Canadians live within 100 kilometres of their border, so their industry is thoroughly integrated with the United States because they had essentially a free trade agreement. It was a bit like us in New Zealand, except they're a lot closer. And so this is really hurting them. And he says, well, if we don't like that, just become the 51st state. Now, this is disturbingly similar to the way Vladimir Putin talks about Ukraine. It's not really a country, should be part of Russia. Thankfully, Donald Trump hasn't sought to invade Canada. But look at the way he's talked about getting hold of it. This is what he said to the Congress: "We will get Greenland one way or the other." Greenland is a territory of Denmark, a NATO ally. So this is a very different America. Look at the way the system is operating in the United States. Their democratic system is operating there. You've seen the extraordinary attacks on the judiciary that have come out of the administration. You've seen the way in which the voting arrangements for federal elections are determined by the state parliaments or state legislatures. In so many jurisdictions there, the law is tilted to make it harder for people to vote. Districts, electorates are gerrymandered so as to advantage one party or another. So much so that there are very few electorates or districts, as they call them in America, in the House of Representatives, which are genuinely contestable. That is to say that could be won by a Republican or a Democrat. What that means, of course, is that if you've got a district that can only be won by a Republican, then the only contest that matters is not the general election but the primary. And at the primary, it's only the more zealous Republicans, and the same applies on the Democratic side, that will vote in the primary. So naturally, in order to win that support, you have to rush off to the right if you're a Republican, or rush off to the left if you're a Democrat. And so you can see that their system, all of this combined with extensive voter suppression, voluntary voting, very large percentage of the population are not even on the roll, there's no obligation to be on the roll, means that their politics has become more and more polarised. And that is absolutely what you don't want to achieve. So, democracy, people say, what is democracy? Well, you can say it's the majority gets to form the government. Yes, that's true. But what makes a democracy is exactly what the diggers at Eureka were talking about, which is the rule of law and fairness. And the fact that just because you are the majority does not mean you can dispossess or persecute the minority. Once you get into a democratic situation or democracy where the rule of law is no longer respected, then you've got to ask yourself, is it still a democracy in the way that we understand it? Now, these are challenges these are risks that we face in Australia, but we have to be That's why I was saying earlier this week in Parliament, we have to be determined to stand up against it. I'm confident that we can. We have made some pretty serious mistakes, however, in recent times. Some of you may have heard me being critical of the AUKUS deal with the United States. I'm happy to take some questions on that. I can, as Lucy knows all too well, I can bore for the world. So I'm going to. So I warn you. but I just make this. It is a mistake that is in some respects similar to Brexit, which was a terrible mistake too, the Brits made. So, and it's in a sense it was a mistake of timing. See, the British chose to leave the largest free trade zone in the world at a time in history when protectionism was on the rise again. You know, Donald Trump was coming back into office. You know, I remember when I was Prime Minister in 2015, 2016, you know, everyone was talking about free trade. I remember going to a G20 meeting in Hangzhou near Shanghai, and everyone, Obama, Xi Jinping, you know, other leaders, me, of course I remember my own speech, but everyone more or less said protectionism was a bad idea. I remember Xi Jinping said it was like, you know, locking yourself in a darkened room and, you know, and just isolating yourself. I said that, you know, people that think protectionism is a way to get out of the low growth trap is a mistake, and it's actually a shovel to dig it deeper. And, you know, we're all using rhetoric like that. But in the meantime, history was moving, you know, people like Trump were moving, protection was on the rise. That's when the Brits, 2016, voted to leave the European Union. So they're now in a position where their economy is markedly, unequivocally damaged, and not just in economic terms, by the decision to leave Europe. They picked literally the worst moment to go. I mean, you mentioned in the citation, Eric, thank you, keeping the Trans-Pacific Partnership going. You know, that was a really good achievement of our diplomacy. In fact, it was Lucy. Again, as you probably gathered, Lucy and I are a pretty tight team, but we persuaded Shinzo Abe, he was there with his wife Akie in January 2017, that even though the Americans had pulled out, we should keep going. And Abe at that time was, you know, he thought it was all over. You couldn't really fathom how you could pursue this big free trade deal across the Pacific without American leadership. And my attitude was, and Lucy's attitude was very much, well, out of the room, out of the deal. The Americans have left, it's nothing personal, they're out of it, we just keep going. And you know, persuaded Shinzo, and of course, and then we other leaders, and then other governments, and we did. And that's been a great success. And it's interesting now, in response to Trump's pulling the United States out of the free trade agenda and imposing all these tariffs, other countries that still believe in those values, still believe in the rule of law, still believe that might should not be right, still believe in free trade, are working together. So the European Union, I believe, will shortly conclude a free trade deal with Australia. That was actually, that process was started when I was PM, and then it got blown out of the water with the AUKUS decision. I mean, our poor ambassador in Paris after that, Julian Birch, he couldn't get a phone call's return from the post office, let alone paid or say. But anyway, it's back on the agenda. And Emmanuel Macron was in Singapore recently speaking at the Shangri-La conference and said, you know, the European Union should be working to come into a trade relationship with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So, you know, there's a lot. So the rest of us are going to, hopefully, we should be working together to keep on with that agenda outside of the US. But, you know, the challenge, therefore, is standing our ground and being thoroughly sovereign and thoroughly independent. And that's why AUKUS is a mistake like Brexit, because it has, in a nutshell, made us more dependent on the United States right at a time when the United States has become much less dependable. Now, that is not a criticism of the United States. They are saying we are less dependable. Their message to their allies is, you can't count on us. Their message to the Europeans is, you can't count on us. Their message to the Ukrainians is, you're on your own. I mean, look at, who would imagine that we could be in a situation where Russia has invaded criminally, unlawfully, wantonly, an independent country, Ukraine, and the United States now attempting to negotiate a peace settlement, is doing so by trying to bully and coerce the weaker, wronged party to submit to the strong aggressor, right? You would think, if you were the great superpower, you would think, if you weren't in love with Vladimir Putin, you would be putting the pressure on the Russians, wouldn't you? You'd be putting that pressure on them to get them to back down. So it's a very, very different environment. That's the fundamental problem with AUKUS. It's So bottom line, the Eureka values of independence, sovereignty, dignity, democracy are more important than ever, and we must not take any of them for granted. We must not forget their sacrifice, their heroism and their achievements, and we have to make sure that right at this time in particular, we are more focused than ever on an independent, on a sovereign Australia whose democracy of long standing we will continue to cherish and protect in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Malcolm's indicated he's quite prepared for questions, so I'd ask each of you to think about your questions and let us know what they are. Mary Howard.
Would you like to use this?
Thanks, Evan. Mr. Turnbull, I heard you talk in Warragul a number of years ago, before the referendum about the marriage equality, and I was so impressed with your courage. You were talking about why can't Bill and Steve have the same attributes or the same privileges that Lucy and I have got. And I went home thinking of Sir Humphrey, very courageous minister. Would you like to comment? To me, it seems that courage is sadly missing right across the board in our politics at the moment.
Well, look, I won't. It's easy to, criticise people who are in the fray. I won't. So I'll resist that. But it's interesting. There's like a bit of a story about that phrase, which I'll tell you. So, one of the arguments I used to use in this issue about marriage equality was actually provided with an anecdote by another Irish Australian called Tony Doherty, who was then Monsignor Tony Doherty, who was then the Dean of St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney, and a very, very, very good friend of ours. And Tony used to conduct the 6 p.m. Mass on a Sunday. And at this stage, George Pell had just become appointed Archbishop of Sydney. And he's, the Mass is over, congregation are filing out into the evening. And, older lady, she was a little lady, not frail. She came out, she was not the last to come out, and she said, "Father, is it true the Archbishop said God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve?" And Tony said, wearily, "Well, I'm afraid he did say that, yes." And she said, "Oh, very well. Father, could you ask him for me, if God didn't make Adam and Steve, who did?" And top it off into the glue. So that's where that story, that's a true true story from Tony. Yeah. Yeah. Just speak up. Really.
Hello.
Yeah.
Wonderful to hear you in action. Congratulations.
Oh, thank
Such
you.
deserved honour. I was going to go to August, but you've already been there.
Well, you can go. That's wherever you like.
But because I woke up on that morning on the 15th of September 2021 to see a three-way press conference with President Biden referring to your successor as that fella down under.
You forgot his name. Yeah.
But I had a feeling my sovereignty had just been pinched.
It had been.
And it wasn't necessarily about hardware. I mean, I know you are very active with Emmanuel Macron, French submarine, later on trade.
Yeah.
But for me, fascinating because France is so committed to the city.
Yeah.
But the underlying thing is that both sides of politics brought off from the idea in a bipartisan fashion. And I don't remember there being a conversation, a debate, a discussion in Parliament.
There wasn't.
And I don't just mean buying equipment for $368 billion. I mean having American bases on Australian soil. So we're not very well equipped as a country about considering debating long-term structural issues like this. Democracy tends to run to the centre, as you say, but to the short term. How do we shift that engagement to being public?
Well, look, Steve, that's a really good point. I mean, the story. The bottom line is, the story is the idea to do this deal to acquire, nuclear-powered submarines from the UK and in the interim from the United States was, cooked up by Scott Morrison. This is not a criticism, just telling you the fact. In a very, very, very small group, it wasn't properly. It wasn't even debated properly within government. France was lied to. The French were told literally the week before that everything was great and the partnership with France was going ahead. Morrison's defence as to why he misled France was just different times he said he didn't mislead France, but he did, and it's all in writing, so you can't get around that. But his defence is to say, well, if we told them the truth, they would have done something to scuttle the AUKUS deal. It's a bit like what John Kerr said about not advising Whitlam, what he was planning to do. Kerr's defence was to say, well, if I told Whitlam that, if the supply bills hadn't been passed by a certain time, I'd dismiss him, he would have sacked me instead. Which is, of course, there's no defence at all. People should behave honestly and do their duty without regard to the consequences for themselves. But anyway, getting back to AUKUS, so it was a terrible situation with our relations with France, made Australia look thoroughly untrustworthy and so forth. The problem that we've got is that we will almost certainly end up with no submarines from the United States, not because they are untrustworthy or bad people or anything like that, but because they will not be able to spare them. And the Americans have made it very clear, in fact it's in their legislation, that no submarine can be sold to Australia unless the President certifies, among other things, that the Navy can spare them. Okay? So, and at this stage they're producing about half as many submarines a year as they need for their own Navy. So, they're just not producing enough. So they've got to go from producing about 1.3 on average subs a year to 2.3 or 4 to even be able to contemplate. And anyway, again, as I say, I can go on too long about this, but we're likely to end up with no subs. So people say, will Donald Trump like the AUKUS deal? Of course he loves it. I mean, it is ridiculous. I mean, the Australian, some people in Australia's anxiety about being loved by the Americans is second only to the British, who go on and on about the special relationship. I mean, the British, sometimes when they talk about the special relationship, they remind me of a sort of anxious boyfriend who's saying to his girlfriend, do you love me? Do you really love me? And I know I called you half an hour ago, but you sure you still love me? And you know, this is, that only invites contempt from the other side, naturally. So the bottom line is, the Americans are getting $3 billion US in cash. They're getting at our expense a big naval dockyard and a big naval base for their submarines in Perth. They have no obligation to sell us any subs, which we'll pay full price for, of course, unless they can spare them, and at this stage that seems most unlikely. And as for the partnership with the UK, that is unlikely to produce anything, if it ever does, for 20 years. So, you know, I mean, people say, oh, Xi Jinping will be worried about AUKUS. I mean, as Paul Keating said, it's like throwing, you know, toothpicks at a mountain. It was ridiculous. Now, again, to quote PJK, who's very quotable, of course, as he said at the time of that AUKUS announcement, he said there were 3 leaders there announcing that deal, and there was only one of them paying for it. And sadly, that was our bloke. And now, the politics of it is, which is what you're really asking me about, was this is an initiative of Morrison. He gave the Labor Party, then in opposition, 24 hours notice. They signed up to it with no papers, in a shadow cabinet meeting. It was on the telephone. They did it because they didn't want to get wedged politically. So that was, you know, look, maybe that, again, I don't want to, it was a terrible decision, a shocking decision. But then when they got into office and they had the opportunity to review it and so forth and change course, they didn't do so because they did not want to be seen as being weak on national security. Well, I'm afraid to say AUKUS is bad for us in terms of sovereignty, it's bad for us financially, it's an asymmetric, unfair deal, and it's bad for security. In fact, the French Foreign Minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, said at the time, Australia has sacrificed sovereignty for security, but will wind up losing both. And that's, so it was a massive mistake. But anyway, how it will unfold, I'm not sure, but they, you know, there it is. I'll start quoting W.B. Yeats at this point.
I read regarding this week that there is a secret review going on in Parliament. They are actually reviewing the thing behind closed doors. Any comment on that? It's change.
Well, I don't. There is a. No, I'm not aware of there being a parliamentary review in Australia. No, if it's secret, it's a secret from me. I mean, the British Parliament's having a review, but again, for the Brits, it's a great deal because they're basically the United Kingdom budget, as you've just seen from the UK budget. If you know, it came out yesterday or the day before. You know, they are really strapped. Their government's under terrible pressure financially, and they've got the Australians to essentially pay half the cost of their submarine program. So. And we're giving them $3,000 US, $3 billion US dollars as well. So it's we're just like absolute mugs in this deal. I mean, it's terrible.
I come from a large family, I can shout. I was just wondering, getting back to our friend Trump, the midterms next year for the Congress, where sort of half the Senate and half the Congress get elected in, I'm hopeful that the Democrats will get in and have a majority. How do you think Trump will deal with that? So, sort of things, you know, he'll just override things even though he's not allowed to.
Well, yeah. I mean, if the Democrats could win control of the House of Representatives, it's very unlikely they'll get control of the Senate. But the whole of the House of Representatives comes up every 2 years, and we think 3 years is too short for House of Representatives. The Americans do it every 2 years, which is nuts too. You know, there it is. It's in their constitution. As a colleague of mine once said, complaining about Australia's federation is like complaining about Switzerland's mountains. So, I think that would produce some balance for sure. Trump will obviously be very angry and rage against it, but you know only thing I'd say, I'd just say this, say a couple of things about Trump. I mean, I know the guy well. I've obviously had a notoriously big row with him, which actually worked out very well. Standing up to bullies is the only way to win their respect, and I had a productive relationship with him thereafter. Trump, in his first term, had effectively fluked winning the Republican nomination. No one expected him to win that, and then nobody expected him to win the general election. Everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. He got into office, he wasn't prepared at all, and he didn't have a team of loyal cadres, colleagues with him, advisors with him, and he recruited people, some of whom were good, some of whom were not so good. And he had people like James Mattis, his defence secretary, very distinguished general, who was a man of conservative political views, I've got no doubt, but absolutely was not a Trump fanaticist. And needless to say, they fell out. This time round, he was thoroughly prepared. He has total control of the Republican Party. He had a whole agenda to put into play, and his staff and his team were selected almost entirely on the basis of their loyalty to him. I'm not saying there aren't people of ability there are, but they all are absolutely loyal to him. So this is a much more coherent administration than it was the last time. And what follows from that is that, assuming the Constitution is in force and he doesn't find some way to run for a third term, and so the next president from 28 will be somebody else, I don't think we should assume normal transmission is going to resume. I think there has been a very big change. I don't think America's going to go back, to free trade or